Assalamu alaikum. This is Yahya. I'm continuing my reading of Muslim Spain and Portugal. We left off with Toledo. Toledo, a superior natural fortress. Perhaps this failure was partly a result of a lack of population, or at least of arm-bearing population. When Saladin invaded the Kingdom of Jerusalem in 1187, the Crusades mustered a large army to oppose him, but to do so they had to empty their cities and fortifications of men. When they lost the Battle of Hattin, they splattered castles, were left virtually undefended. Most of them soon fell to the invaders. This may well have been the same in the case of the Visigoth Spain. Now, as I previously said in my last video, I don't believe so. The population was far more vast than that. It was a sheer hatred of the actual Visigoth kings and the royal family and the various nobility. They were not very popular. It was perhaps the number of populations generally was lacking, but rather the number of military men were inadequate. I've said that before. In Cordoba, the Muslims were informed by a shepherd that the Met of the people had fled. The garrison of 400 and the Duafa remained. The Duafa is the Arabic word which refers to non-armed bearing parts of the population. It was clearly considered out of the question that such people would participate in the defence of the city. The Muslim world would never attack women and children, and even men who didn't bear arms. They were to be left alone, and this was Islamically normal. This is where the morality comes in. Another factor is the lack of resistance may have been that the Visigoths did not take the invasion sufficiently serious. It had already been noted that Rodrigo's opponents among the aristocracy were hoping the invaders would defeat him and depart, leaving them in charge. Now this comes back to my previous conversation where I said that the Visigoths, or some parts of the southern Visigoths, were or may have been still cannibals, and that Christendom hadn't actually directly fully Christianized the southern Visigoths, which would have provoked the Moran people to come north. There are a couple of Arabic chronicles and several verses that mention about cannibalism of the Visigoths. Now, I'm not saying that they're historically relevant. I'm saying that there is some evidence that points in that direction, which could have led. Now, this could have been entirely for booty, as this apologetic Christian paper says. And to be fair, Muslim Spain and Portugal sounds incredibly apologetic already. Another factor of the resistance may have been that the Visigoths did not take the invasion sufficiently seriously. It already had been noted that Rodrigo's opponents among the aristocracy were hoping the invaders would defeat him and leave. It seems that Tarquin had to persuade Musa to allow the Muslims to settle in Spain, and as late as 717, the Caliph Umayyad bin Abd al-Aziz appointed a governor whose mission was to evacuate the Muslims. In all honesty, the Caliphate at that time period had no interest in it. They thought Iberia was too far for them to protect. They had other campaigns going on. They had other conflicts that they needed those Muslim soldiers back. It must have seemed to many in Spain that the logical response to the Muslim raiders was to retreat to their mountain fastnesses with what they could carry and wait for them to take their booty and go. On the whole, the Muslim offered generous terms which certainly made surrender a more attractive option, whereas unsuccessful resistance could, as the unfortunate defenders of Cordoba found, lead to death. In Andalusia, the sons of Wizards seem to have been allowed to retain possessions of the royal lands. In the Murcias area, the terms amounted to local autonomy. In Murcia, the inhabitants were allowed to keep their possessions, but the property of those who had been killed in battle for the city, those who had fled north, and the churches was confiscated. In the later phase of the conquest, many Visigoth lords in the Ebro Valley area were allowed to retain their land status as soon converted to Islam. Among the best known of them were the Ban Qizir or Cassiists of Turias and the Ban Umaras of Husra, who formed dynasties which dominated the area for 2 centuries after Muslim conquest. This is my point. This is where the disintegration of Arab-Bebian leadership starts, when the integration of marriage and everything else. Now, I'm not saying this is a bad thing. This is where the westernization, the actual in form of ethnicity, where the sight of blonde and blue-eyed started to creep in amongst the nobility, because basically dozens and dozens of Hispanic nobles converted. Many of them were Visigoths. Visigoths were by their nature blonde and blue-eyed. Were formed dynasties which dominated the area for 2 centuries in the Muslim conquest. Except for the actions against the church lands, this fit in well with what we know of Muslim terms elsewhere. The local people were allowed to remain in their possessions of their lands as long as they paid a land tax and poll tax to their conquerors. The settlements of Muslims, chapter 2. In the event, Spain provided too attractive to its conquerors that they did not leave by choice to settle in new lands. In the Eastern Islamic world, it had been the intention that the Muslims should settle only in certain garrison towns like Kifa and Basra in Iraq, Fusrat, Old Cairo in Egypt, and Qalaras in Ifrit, and that they should live off the taxes of the land. No effort seems to have been made to develop such a system in Spain, and Muslim settlements seem to have been haphazard and determined by the intentions of the settlers rather than an overall scheme. The conquest settled down as proper ownership and proper owners, and do not seem to have received the ate or pensions, which was such an important feature of early Muslim society in the Middle East. This in turn meant that there was no need for the elaborations and precautious bureaucracy which had grown up to serve the system, nor any need to compel diwa or lists of those entitled to pensions. The slow development of bureaucracy in Al-Andalus may in turn have been a reason for the slow development of literature and culture, not until the time of Abdul al-Rasus II in 822 to 52 did administration and native literacy culture begin to appear. What they're saying is that the Arabs and much of the Bedouins were still living in their own close-knit communities. Occasionally they took wives from the Christians, and the Christians intermarried and converted to Islam during this time period. So this is like the real early Andalusian periods. Cordoba became the capital shortly after the initial conquests and remained critical to the politics of the period. Control of the capital was vital for anyone who sought to govern the country, and no serious attempt was made to shift the capital elsewhere. The reason for this are not clear at first. It was not the Romans or Byzantine capital had little obvious strategic importance. It was, however, at the hinge of a number of important routes. To the north, the road ran through the passes of Sierra Mora to the Caltaveria and Toledo, and eventually to the Ibn Valley. To the east, the upper Guadalquivir Valley gave access to the Levette, whilst the south and west Elved or Granada and Servia were easily accessible. The geography of Al-Andalus always made communications a problem, but Cordoba was probably the last inconvenient site for the centre of government. Perhaps more important was the rich agricultural hinterland of the city. Now, Cordoba it has entire poems written about their actual hinterland, their farmland, their figs, their grapes. So, yeah, not really surprising. And the fact that there was a densely settled by the Muslims. The resources of supply, men were often able to sustain the rulers when, in the region of the Amir Ab al-Al, 8 to 912, for example, other areas slipped out of their control. Toledo, another possible capital and the centre of the Visigoth power, was clearly lacking in local resources. The non-Muslim population probably paid some tax to Cordoba, probably a jizya, a poll tax, perhaps a land tax as well. This has been actually disproven. Much of Islamic Spain, very rarely, other Islamic countries that had large Christian populations did, but Islamic Spain didn't. Because quite honestly, the Spanish Muslims couldn't be bothered to go collect it. Absolutely honestly, they just thought it was a waste of time. They knew their neighbours. If they needed hounds with farming and that lot, their neighbours would give it. And this is what we get, the Muslim closeness between Christians, Jews and Muslims of all denominations. This is why, in my opinion, Al-Andalus was the best Muslim-run state in all of history. Naturally, people from the same tribe and ethnic backgrounds tended to settle in the same area and in areas they considered appropriate for their lifestyle. On the whole, the Arabs settled in the main cities and the fertile irrigated areas of the Guadalquivir Valley, the Levette around Murias and Zagria, and the middle Ebon Valley. In some places, there were concentrations of men from the same tribes in the same area. Lakhim around Malarus, for example, and the Judahims and Turids, who settled in the Zagros, were to dominate the political life of the city and the surrounding areas for centuries to come. Other tribes were more disappeared. What they mean is that they basically merged with other of the larger tribes at the time. It would be wrong to think that these Arabs as Bedouins, apart from the Qurayshis, almost all of them belonged to the Yemen group of Arab tribes. Some of these, like Lahim and Juhim, had lived in the steppe lands of Jordan and South Palestine, whilst others, like Khazraj and Malhuz, came from Yemen proper, a land of cities, well-built villages and carefully tended farms. In either cases, they would have been familiar with urban and agricultural lifestyle. Many of them were second or third generation immigrants to North Africa, reared in such urban settlements as Fusa and Quarin, well placed to take advantage of the opportunities offered by their newly conquered lands. Tribal loyalties did not seem to have been strong. The settlers acquired land in absolute ownership. Basically, tribal loyalty started breaking down, and this is where the beginning of Al-Andalusian or Islamic Spain's identity started to begin. Sometimes it would seem by inheritance, marriage and the daughters of previous Visigoth owners, as Abu al-Azhar's Musa married Rodrigo's daughter, and Sarah, granddaughter of Wizard, married two Arab husbands in succession, founded a dynasty which produced, among others, the 10th century historian Ibn al-Quiris. He's one of the writers of the historical records we literally use for discussing things that happened in Al-Andalus. The integration of important elements of Visigoth aristocracy into the new Muslim ruling class certainly accounted for some of the lack of opposition. The Bebians were widely distributed throughout the Al-Andalus, because many settled in the central Mestre, Extermina, and the whole of the north and west apart from Zagreb and in Everest. Certain important cities like Toledo and Merida lay in areas with a predominantly Bebian population. There were also a significant Bebian presence in the Valencia area, where they probably practices transhumanists, wintering flocks on the coastal plains and moving west into the mountains for the summer. And the Gadran Valley, the lands were in some ways less rich and inviting than the areas settled by the Arabs, and it had been suggested that the Bebians were obliged to accept inferior lands despite the major contribution they had made to the conquests. However, there are reasons for thinking that this may not have been the case. I don't buy this. I don't buy this in the slightest, because the Arab rulers at this time period, we're talking about 50 years on now, most of the Arab lords were Arab only in name. They were already what you would call mixed race in modern society. So I don't buy this racist stuff at this time period. The lands were also less rich, fertile lands, despite the majority of that. However, there are reasons for thinking that this may not have been the case, as they would have seen there was no overall direction or system in the allocation of land, and given the small numbers of the conquests, the vast extent of the conquered lands, they would certainly have been able to take over richer areas had they wished to. Some Bebians were certainly farmers used to irrigated agriculture, but the majority seem to have been pasture people. This is more likely. They took the lesser lands because they could raise livestock, which was the profession they were before they became raiding Muslim soldiers. Some Bebians were certainly farmers used to irrigate agriculture, but the majority seem to have been pasture people, and it was natural that they should gravitate to the familiar pasture environments of the Iberian Peninsula. It is quite possible that many Bebians brought flocks with them, with the results that they had no alternative but to look for pasture. They did not mean that they were not conflicts between Arabs and Bebians, which eventually erupted in civil war, but there is no evidence that grievances over land were among the causes of them. The early government, 714 to 741. The years between the departure of Musa al-Nusrin in 714 and the installation of Balji Bismar al-Quazurio, I'm probably pronouncing that horrifically, as governor in 741, were the periods when these early settlers enjoyed unopposed power. At first glance, it is a period of great confusion. Governors succeeded each other with bewildering speed. Only one, Anbus B. Suran al-Kibad, lasted for more than a year or two. Beneath this confusion, however, there are several common themes. The settlers wanted to control the riches of the Al-Andalus for themselves and to increase their wealth by raiding areas in France, which were still in the Dar al-Hawars, House of War, that is, non-Muslim territory, and from which booty could be obtained. It did not especially matter to them whether the governors who ruled the country were chosen by them. That sometimes happens, practically when the previous governors had died a violent death or appointed from outside, as long as they were responsive to their needs. In contrast to the period which followed 471, the first quarter of the century was comparatively free of internal strife and rebellion. This is the build-up to the Andalusian period, basically when they weren't starting their fights. When Musa al-Bashir's departed, he left his son Abu al-Azir in charge. He established himself as a governor in Seville, married Rodrigo's widow. The story in the Arabic sources explains that she persuaded him to wear a crown and adopt the other royal pretensions as the Visigoth kings had, and that the Arab notables saw this as un-Islamic and assassinated him. This certainly reflects their fears that he was attempting to make the governorship his family property. There may also have been concerns that he was encouraging new settlers from North Africa and the Middle East who would demand a share of the wealth of the country. The struggle of the early areas to maintain their privileged status in the face of challenges from later immigrants was to be a major source of unrest in the period of the governors. After Abu al-Azir's, no governor died a violent death before 741, except at the hands of infidels, and there was no rebellions of importance. There were some minor revolutions, if you go through the chronicles in their Arabic format, but these chronicles tended to be more nuanced rebellions. They were more landowning disputes between other landowners, at which point the governor would come in with his men, clap a few heads, maybe a few sheep, goats, and that all passed over with a bit more tilling land left and right, but it was generally resolved. So there wasn't proper what you would call historical revolts. Muslim Spain was only loosely attached to the main body of the caliphate, but given the vast distance involved, it is impressive to see how much influence the Umayyad caliphs in Damascus could exert on this. the newest and most distant of their provinces. Governors were in general appointed by the governor of Ifriqi in Quest, or sometimes, as in the case of Al-Samad Malik Al-Queleng, by the caliph in person, and they were almost always outside the province with no local power base or following. This did not always mean that the wishes of the local people were ignored, and the Akbar al-Majara states, perhaps with extravagant local patronism, that if they did not like their governor, or if he attempted to undermine their autonomy and privileged physical status, they would write to the caliph, who would send one who pleased them. This was normal. If the Muslim landowners in the Iberia got pissed, they'd write to the caliph. The caliph would replace him. He's a governor. His job is to be there because the caliph puts him there. Piss off your tenants. Tenants write to your boss. Sometimes, if the governor was killed, the settlers would elect a successor, but such elections were not usually accepted by Qawarin. When Al-Asim bin Malik was killed in the attack on Toulouse, they chose Abd al-Rahmin bin Abdul Ali al-Garin, but the governor of Qawarin sent Anabas bin Surin. When Anabas was himself killed whilst raiding in France in Toulouse, local people again elected, and again their nomination was rejected. But in 730, an unpopular outsider was replaced by Abu al-Ramazin al-Garis as a sop to local opinion. The caliph in Damascus was remembered in the Friday prayers, and his name appeared on the coins. Whether he received any more tangible benefits is not clear. In Muslim law, a fifth of the wealth seized at the time of conquest belongs to the caliph, as a fifth had originally been reserved for the Prophet Muhammad. But it is unlikely that the caliph ever received any revenues from that fifth. Any attempt to secure a share the revenues of Al-Andalus by the Umayyad government was vigorously resisted by early settlers. In 718, the reformed Caliph Umayyad II, 712-20, appointed Al-Salim bin Malik al-Quwalim as governor to implement the physical reforms he had been introducing throughout the caliphate. These reforms were big, and they caused problems. The governor arrived with a body of followers said to have been equal in number to the original conquests. His first task apparently was to send to the caliph a detailed description of Al-Andalus, its rivers and its seas, a sort of doomsday book. Then, in order to provide for his newly arrived followers, he intended to separate the lands that had been taken by force, Anawatan, from the land that had been taken as a result of treaty, Suran, and to take a fifth of the Anawatan as the governor's share and distribute the remaining 4/5 among the new arrivals. Predictably, this aroused the indignations of the people of the conquest, and they sent a deputized to the caliph, who responded by confirming the villages in the hands of those who had taken them as booty. They would be liable to pay the usha, or tithe, of this land. The newcomers were accommodated by dividing the caliphate's fifth among them in territories concessions, equit. For the first time, the land was asserted for taxation, with the intentions that the surplus should be sent to Damascus. As happened in other provinces, the caliphate, in the case of Al-Andalus, Al-Sam was allowed to use such revenues as remained after the payments of salaries and the expenses of the Holy War for rebuilding of the bridges and city walls in Cordoba. In short, there is no unequivocal evidence that the caliph received anything beyond gifts at the time of conquest from Al-Andalus. In short, he got nothing. He sent them out. They had his blessing. Remember, the caliph at this point was both a religious and governorship of the Islamic world. So it was being this looseness was an advantage. There was no unequivocal evidence that the caliph received anything beyond gifts at the time of the conquest from Al-Andalus, or that any financial strings bound the province to the central government. After the death of Caliph in 720 and Al-Salam in 721, their centralised measures seem to have been allowed to lapse. The governors also issued coins from the earliest times in order to facilitate the distribution of booty and then the payments of taxes. The first of these dates from immediately after the first conquest, 711-12, though they bear Latin inscriptures such as the Islamic monotheist formula in nomini domini non nisus duas sulas non ducis similares. They are based not on Visigoth coins but on those issued by the Muslims in North Africa and ultimately on Byzantine originals. Under the governorship of Al-Husa 716-18, coins with bilateral Latin-Arabic inscriptions were minted, and in 720 Al-Asams, as part of his fiscal reforms, minted the first purely Arabic coins. So we date the coins in 720 as the first Arabic ones, which by itself was a massive achievement. Remember, at this point, they hadn't been there that long. Right, I'm going to bookmark, and that's me done for my 20 minutes. This is chapter 4. We've entered, number 4 of my 20-minute block. We're now into the settlements of Islamic Spain early. I hope you enjoyed it. Alhamdulillah. I hope to see you next time.